Welcome to Bloom, a podcast about anything and everything. I'm fortunate to be joined today by my dear friend Dr. Paul Monk. Building on our latest recording of poetry, today's episode will feature a selection of poems from Paul's anthology, Love on the Road of Life. This work is dedicated to Paul's friend Claudia Alvarez, with whom Paul has shared a deep and rich relationship for the past 20 years, while living on opposite sides of the world. As he has said in more than one podcast, Paul credits Claudia with having opened the door to him becoming a writer and a poet. Paul, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be back. And this is a special occasion. Claudia, as I think I've remarked in, as you say, in more than one instance, said to me many years ago, in a context I'll never forget, that I am, or you are, she said to me, a writer and a poet, and you should embrace that while there's still time. You only live once. And we had been living together at that point, but she decided ultimately she needed to return to her home country, Venezuela. And I was grief-stricken when she left, but I understood that she needed to, and I came to terms with that. And over the years since then, I've written her a lot of poetry. I'll share 30 of the poems this afternoon that I've written for her during that time. But I'd like to start by actually sharing the brief preface I've written to this collection, which directly addresses her, but it's worth sharing because it opens up the context in which the poems were written and the spirit in which they'll be recited. Let me, however, launch into that with a brief quote from William Waters, whose book Poetry's Touch on Lyric Address, published in 2003, I just happened to have read for the first time before Claudia arrived in Australia. And it's one of a handful of books about poetry that have had a profound influence on me. On the page 1 of that book, he wrote, "To whom does a poem speak? Do poems really communicate with those they address? Is reading poems like overhearing, like intimate conversation, like performing a script?" That, it seems to me, is the context in which not only have I written poetry since then, but the spirit in which I address Claudia in this preface to the poems I selected from the ones I've written for her, and as an introduction to the poems that I'll share this afternoon. The preface reads as follows: Claudia, Claudia, I am writing this in the immediate aftermath of the presidential elections in Venezuela, in which Nicolas Maduro, roundly defeated, nonetheless, like so many of our neo-authoritarians in the 2020s, simply denied defeat and is clinging to office by force and fraud. This book is the story, in poetry, of our own vote on life since 2004, at least as seen through the eyes and recorded by the pen, or at least the typing fingers, of your writer and poet. The poems, of course, are no more than a set of snapshots. They are not by any means all of the poems that knowing you has inspired me to compose over 20 years. They do, however, arranged in this form, seem to me to offer a striking overview of how we have come to know each other, overcome the usual difficulties of two people building intimacy and trust, and then explored the world, both intellectually and culturally, in each other's company. This book is for you, though for the time being it will lodge in my domestic archive. It is part of a project in which, as I enter my late 60s in indifferent health, plagued by half a dozen ailments, I am going through all my old papers and putting my archived life in order. There will be books of poetry, like this one, books of essays, selected letters, academic papers, and designs for film drama, as well as a 3-volume memoir, if I can find the time to write it. But you, and therefore this book, hold a special place in my life. To you, as much as to anyone, I feel I owe a debt of love and gratitude for having been a catalyst inducing me, at long last, before it was too late, to embrace being a writer and a poet, rather than a businessman who did some writing on the side and lacked belief in himself as a poet. That was now close to 20 years ago. In that time, I've authored a dozen books and hundreds of poems. Well done, you. As you know, one of those books was the highly personal and idiosyncratic attempt at a novel, Darkness Over Love, a complete fiction, in which, starting with a cathartic outpouring of memory and fable, I slowly invented us as Fenimore Monaghan and Margarita Henderson y Mendoza, two free spirits who travel the world and form a rarefied bond. You have urged me in recent years, why don't we go back and finish this story? What a use of the first-person plural. I don't know whether I will be able to do that now, but as I remarked to you some time ago, it has become clear to me that that entire exercise was a massive psychodynamic exercise in which, after your departure in 2007, I sought to reframe my whole sense of who I am. You responded at the time, "I know." It was some years later that all these poems were written. I think of them as the fruit of my reframed thinking. This book is a thank you note for your love and your example. The first few of these poems, though not the first in the book, were written in 2016, when I was on my way via Israel and Malta to visit you in Venezuela for the first time, in Jerusalem last week. Then, when I was with you in Caracas, no water on Ávila, Hugo. Then in Brazil with David Speakman, the pact we've formed, Time and Naipes Hair, and Sao Paulo on foot. Those 5 remain, I think, even now, among my best poems. A victory of love over pain. But it was after we travelled via Boston, Washington and Rome to Marrakesh in 2019 that my poetry took over my psyche, and I began to write as if I truly was a poet. I'll never forget our misadventure on landing in Marrakesh to discover that the authorities there would not allow you into the country. I had to get you on a midnight flight back to Madrid and book you into the only you Atocha, where we had stayed on a visit to Spain together. You were so composed. My fieldwork in Morocco over the following week was a rich experience and may yet bear fruit, if I can persuade a big Hollywood studio to produce my drama for television or live streaming, The Falcon of Spain. Visiting Tangier was a seminal experience. What a history that city has had. But it was as I flew back from Morocco, via Frankfurt, that I felt the sense of a flood of poetry arising in me, as if a dam was about to burst. That was the turning point, I believe. Most of the poems in this book were written after that experience, but the flood began with a massive series of nosebleeds just as I arrived in Singapore. I have always been tempted to interpret them as the physical manifestation of what was happening in my psyche, but they were so serious that I had to concentrate on stanching the flow of blood before I could embrace the flow of poetry. When I did, on my return to Australia, I harvested the fruits of the years. I found myself able to write poems looking back all the way to my early childhood, the magazines and books that had shaped my imagination and had me long to travel and learn about the outside world. It's striking that I had not done this before then. It was you, in 2004, who, listening to my tales of early reading, dubbed me Frodo Baggins. It was you who insisted, in many conversations between then and 2019, that I am a writer and poet. And so it is to you that this first outpouring of poetry is dedicated. It's true, of course, that I had written poems before you entered my life, most notably my sonnets, which were being prepared for publication even as you flew into Melbourne to do the JFK seminar. But looking back, I now think of them as the final phase of my poetic apprenticeship. You called me on to aspire to more, to vary my repertoire, to read modern poets. You gave me Neruda's first book of poems. In other words, there is a history behind the present book which goes back many years, a history in which you have been a key figure. The fourfold division of this book is an attempt to show how the whole story played out. Scenes from my life before you arrived, though written under your influence and with you in mind, your arrival in my world and your desire to share my life, our travels abroad, or a few moments from them, and reflections on what it all means. We have, you know, trod together, even if only lightly, on every continent except Antarctica. Africa very lightly, since we paused in the airport at Casablanca, then arrived in Marrakesh, only for you to be turned away. But wherever we have flown and strolled, the experience has been intense. Think of Toledo and Cordoba, of Boston and Washington, Paris and Rome, of Geneva, Lausanne, Zurich, Venice, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv, and Tantalos Bay in Panama. There are poems here, of course, reflecting on how difficult it proved for us to live an intimate life, simply to be able to give expression to those difficulties, and to argue, even so, that we came through them thinking, learning, growing slowly closer over the course of 2 decades, seems to me to have been a significant achievement. Where so many lovers failed to find a way, we created a way and have become loving companions on the road of life. Poetry that is any good should trigger daisy chains of collateral memories and meanings in the reader's mind, by association and synesthesia, all the more so in poetry read by a person for whom the poems were written and whom they address. I hope that will be so for you in these pages. It will, I should imagine, be especially so in certain cases, notably in parts 2 and 3. And of course there are far more shared memories between us than I have come close to expressing. You will see that the final 3 poems in part 4 reflect on Noelia's passing away. Fermi's paradox, with the idea that, however empty the cosmos may be, you and I are not alone. And this book is Chauvet Cave, which is itself an invitation to read the poems as paintings from the deep past by mysterious artistic hands open to interpretation. I well remember reading Jean Klotz's book on Chauvet Cave and feeling inspired by it to write this poem. I think this selection and presentation are better and more personalized than those in the 3 Graces in 2022, and I've decided to include a set of photographs from our travels in this special archival edition. As things stand, the book will lodge only here in my archive, but I hope in due course to be able to print and bind a copy for you and give it to you in person in the same half Morocco form. May that be so. May it be, in an open and creative future. The first poem I'll read is called Beyond the Borders, and it's about the Shire in Tolkien. The reason I'm starting with Beyond the Borders is because it's about hobbits and the Shire in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And very early in our relationship, when I was sharing with Claudia my enthusiasm for The Lord of the Rings, which she had never read, she dubbed me Frodo Baggins, which was very touching, and she still calls me Frodo. So this is about how I acquired that interest in The Lord of the Rings and in exploring the world of Middle-earth, as it were, beyond the borders. I think my path was laid when I was 10, when I first heard the shadow of the past, which awed my ears with things beyond my ken, and from that time has held my child mind fast, recurring ever in my dreams again. Beyond the river bordering the Shire, there cooled the wild, outside its homely edges, the lure of mountains high and ever higher, and elvish books that made me solemn pledges of knowing the tale of Middle-earth entire. Frodo looked at maps, and so did I, fascinated by their empty spaces, for Shire maps intrigued the curious eye, displaying mostly white in foreign places, provoking a young hobbit's mind to pry. But ventures out beyond were long delayed, the interim spent in questioning dwarves and elves or other strangers who had haply strayed within the Shire's bounds to salve themselves against the dark that on white spaces preyed. Those refugees told many a direful tale that Frodo pondered at his bag-end hearth. They spoke of things to make a hero quail, of lengthening shadows over Middle-earth, and fears that soon at last the West would fail. Little of this, of course, had reached the ears of ordinary hobbits in the Shire, much less the ring, the sum of Gandalf's fears, or Frodo's need to find the Mount of Fire. But these things shaped my mind in after years. The second poem I'll read is Uncanny Gift, which also takes me back to my childhood, which in the poem I'm, as it were, sharing with Claudia, and that is that I had asked my parents to give me a copy for my 12th birthday of Isaac Deutsch's biography of Stalin, which they did. And it's a reflection on, looking back at that, it seems frankly strange that a little boy would ask for that book and that his parents would give it to him. But it, like The Lord of the Rings, and for a very different reason really, shaped my young mind. How does a boy of 11 years not yet out of elementary school, still in short trousers, with voice unbroken, chin unbearded, find himself irresistibly drawn to books like Deutsches Stalin. Yet I was, and look back now in wonder at the very copy gifted at my own request, no less, by young parents. Yes, signed over, in all innocence, this dark weight. Happy birthday, love from Mummy and Daddy. From Mummy and Daddy, with love, on a famous Trotskyist rendering of that tyrant's monstrous life. What possessed the boy to ask his parents to so lightly give a gift of this portentous nature? It wasn't a whim on the child's part, that's clear, since he, my junior self, had autonomously reached out already and bought himself the life of Mao, and Worth's de Gaulle into the bargain, and Moses Finley on the ancient Greeks. That was uncanny enough in a child, one has to say, pondering such purchases now. But the giving, with love, of Stalin, that quite takes an old man's breath away. That's why I've always kept that battered book, long superseded, in awe and wry wonderment. You may have noticed, dear listener, by now that the poems are of approximately the same length. In fact, they're of exactly the same length. Each poem is 30 lines, though stanza lengths vary. And this is a form, as it were, that I invented in the first poems that I wrote, as mentioned in the preface, and decided to stick with so that there'd be kind of symmetry in the set of poems I was writing. The next one is called My Private 4th of July, so we catapult from when I was 12 and reading Stalin to when I was 18, had left school, started law school, and then dropped out of law school, writing myself a manifesto, which has shaped my life ever since. July the 4th, it's true, is claimed by others, a feast day of a well-known public kind. I honor it with our American brothers. On liberty, we're mostly still aligned. But privately, in fact, I celebrate a rebellion that was mine and mine alone, and which occurred, by chance, on that same date when I quit law and struck out on my own. Upon a sombre winter's afternoon, while brooding over some unfinished paper that had to be submitted pretty soon, I decided I'd have done with that whole caper. What the paper was, I can't recall, only that a mood took hold of me that made my basic legal studies pall, a cocktail of ennui and anomie. Who was I that they'd urged to study law? Where, in fact, did I most long to go? Restlessly, I hungered to do more, and so I started dreaming like Rimbaud. I'm out of here, I recklessly decided. There are other things I badly need to know. Abruptly, I then vowed that I'd be guided by an improvised, inspired manifesto. I'll read and think and travel around the world. I'll learn to love and plumb my true desire. I'll study only once my flag's unfurled, then master things that truly light my fire. With that, I left the paper where it lay and set the course I've held until this day. You may have noticed as we go that while each poem, being 30 lines, takes approximately the same amount of time, the stanza lengths differ. The meter tends to be uniform, tends to be pentameters. The rhyme patterns vary, and sometimes there's explicit rhyme, sometimes there's mixed rhyme, slanting rhyme. And this is me simply being free and inventive, and I stick to 30 lines not because I have to, but because it suited me to do so. It's just a decision I made. The next poem is called Book Bindings, and it's about how I decided, years ago now, to get a number of old books that I had inherited from my parents, or grandparents, or a great aunt in one case, rebound to preserve them. They were up to 100 years old by then, and they were literally falling apart. So I had them rebound in buckram with fresh embossed titles with a reader ribbon and a stitched spine, and I'm very pleased with them now. They'll last a good while unless somebody carelessly disposes of them after I'm gone. And the poem is just a reflection on what these books mean to me and what having them rebound signified to me. I took possession of some fraying family books, and on a loving whim rebound them in new covers, dark blue for the history tales of childhood, vividly remembered in all my waking dreams, for the pictures of venturers and heroes like little Marco, previously evoked, but long before him, henge builders and hunters, Boadicea and the Roman legions at war, Alfred and the settlement of Angleterre, William called the Bastard and the Conquest, and on as far as Nightingale, all graced together now and with a golden ribbon, movable between prose tales and drawn dreams, just as, in the tawny-covered volume which lay a lifetime since within my father's hands, the many-coloured maps in that old book, when I was still a child, enthralled my roving eyes. Now a scarlet ribbon, red with history's blood, moves from the dissolution of the Roman Empire, as the venerable title still proclaims, down to the present time, which meant, through each edition up to my father's schooling, the era of the Great War, and then of Hitler's rise. But in Burgundy rest the finely printed works of Shakespeare, dated 1910, and signed Robert Fitzgerald, Springhurst, a century ago. While in a stately black, with golden reader's guide, sits the poetry of Tennyson, and written just inside, Springhurst again, and the words presented to Katie Fitzgerald, and the date 21/3/11. The next poem is called How to Use Our Tongues, and I think I have recited this for Nick in an earlier recording some years ago. But it draws on a wonderful passage in the Odyssey in which Odysseus himself has arrived back, but in disguise. And the undercurrent in the poem is a reflection on the very nature of poetry and how Western poetry has developed over millennia. There is a passage in the Odyssey in which the beauties of Icmelius's chair are brought before our eyes, almost so that we, in wonderment, like its fabled footrest, find ourselves mortised in the frame, draped with a heavy fleece, and listening as Penelope instructs her house-help, Eurynome, to seat the guest for story. Imagine that fine Icmelian craft, and conjure in your mind the scene in which Penelope, in her own voice, declares, "I wish our guest to tell his story whole, and patiently to hear me out as well, as I'll be full of questions, point by point. I want him, seated in our polished chair, to tell me of his travels in good time, for this stranger who has come into our halls may know somewhat of Odysseus himself." All poetry is such an Icmelian chair, its music mortised into practised frames, mellifluous rhyme and artful assonance cast over it like Homer's softened fleece. Through eons, both these crafts have been refined, since earlier than Gilgamesh or Ur, and they have fitly shaped the conversation, from Pindar's odes to Martial's epigrams, of all that we call prosody or verse, and taught us better how to use our tongues. The next poem is called Reading Orlando, a novel by Virginia Woolf. And for the first time here, really, I'm more directly addressing Claudia, because I think she has many of the characteristics less of Virginia Woolf than of Vita Sackville-West, who was actually Virginia's lover, and who was a remarkable character and writer herself. And Orlando was a tribute by Virginia Woolf to Vita Sackville-West. The poem goes as follows. When, at last, I chose to read Orlando, you were a constant presence in its pages, garbed in Marusha's trousers, for example, arriving at our ghostly assignations alone, but cloaked and booted like a man. Marusha, you'll recall, was very striking. Orlando's eye was swiftly captivated, his youthful amour instantly aroused, by the really quite extraordinary allure which issued from her whole seductive person. But that's not half the reason that I found your charismatic presence in the book. It's how and why the novel was conceived and dedicated to V. Sackville-West, an epistle to the gender-bending other. And more again, for both these women grew in households centred on a father's library. The Sackville one at Knoll that Vita knew, Virginia's the hoard of Leslie Stephen, to which, by her account, he gave her access. Each in girlhood greedily devoured all these worlds of letters could divulge, and so acquired a longing for distinction, to find a place among the mostly male authors of the prized, mysterious classics. You breathed with me as I read every page, like Woolf and Sackville West, we too conspire to revel in a liberated age, to engender novel narratives, inspire all those observing us upon life's stage. The next poem is called Philodemus and I. Philodemus of Gadara was a Greek philosopher who settled in Herculaneum beneath Mount Vesuvius and practiced philosophy, writing and teaching. And when Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, he was long dead, but his library was still there in that villa, and it was buried under ash and pumice. In the 18th century, archaeologists began to unearth Herculaneum, and they found this remarkable library. The problem was that all of his books, hundreds and hundreds of them, had been, as it were, fossilized by the ash and the pumice. And as it happens now, using 21st century techniques, specialist archaeologists are trying to discern what's in those scrolls without destroying them. That's a fascinating story in itself, but the poem is more a reflection on the very fact that he had this splendid collection. He was a first-rate thinker, and his books were buried by the eruption of Vesuvius. What does that mean for us all? There's a library that was found at Herculaneum. It belonged once to a sage called Philodemus of Gadara, but he was no Gadarene swine. And when I think of all his books, I think of mine, because of his interests. He was a philosopher of Epicurean leanings. Epicurean, that is, in the uncaricatured sense of serious atomism and its many implications. They're more in terms of ethics than of physics, the science of mensana. He studied for a while in Alexandria, where he made friends, then moved to Sicily, but his atomism there caused some offence, and so he settled on the Bay of Naples, beneath Vesuvius. There, in a splendid Roman villa, his collection of the works of Epicurus and learned treatises regarding all the schools of classic Grecian thought in countless scrolls long outlasted him, until the famed Vesuvius erupted and all his books were buried deep in pumice. But in our time much has been recovered. Its learned range and quality are striking, as with my collection. What most arrests my scholarly attention is that these ancient books were found at all, not lost, like many others in Rome's fall, for centuries after the eruption. Will mine endure? There's a sister poem to that called Volcanic Texts, which takes that last line and reflects on it a bit further. Will my books endure? I've come to wonder. In thinking of the scrolls of Philodemus, recovered, so the scholars have informed us, from the ruins of Herculaneum, his many hundred damaged papyri. Clearly, what I mean is, books can vanish, as had all the books of Epicurus, all the works of great Democritus, and the scholarks of the Epicurean garden, even of the famed Apollodorus. But let's allow a subtler view of things, reflecting on the scrolls that were recovered, the way that the less damaged inner parts of his and of his sources' treatises have been retrieved to our enlightenment. Isn't that what all interpretation, all close reading, all true comprehension, what we call hermeneutics, aims to do with any book, in whole or treasured part? Don't texts, if they endure, require such art? So it would be with any work of mine. It might remain on silent library shelves, unread, neglected, dust-begrimed, forgotten, and, if so, would be like the pumice scrolls long immured at Herculaneum. But should a curious soul, by any chance, stumble on an archived tome of mine, its inner core and endings would require quite as careful hermeneutic treatment as the long-forgotten works of Philodemus. The ninth poem, and we're now in part 2 of the 4 parts of Love on the Road of Life, is about the moment in which Claudia pitched to me, if not proposed to me, saying she wanted to share my life, and it's a treasured moment. It's called our Ringstrasse moment, and the background to this, although the poem is largely self-explanatory, is that she declared herself to be Alma Mahler. And for those unaware of who Alma Mahler was, she was a beautiful young woman in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, 125 years ago. And she rather fancied being married to Gustav Mahler, who was, or appeared to be, a romantic figure because he was the director of the Vienna Opera and a great composer. So she did what a beautiful young woman does, and she got her man. They married, and then she discovered that though he was a great composer, he actually wasn't particularly romantic. He loved her in his own way, but he was very immersed in his own work and really expected her to be a kind of Hausfrau, which she wasn't happy with. And so she ended up having a variety of lovers, and she left him and married Franz Werfel, a novelist, and then left him and married, now I'm going to forget his name, Walter Gropius of the Bauhaus School, an architect. So when Claudia says she's alma mater, on the spot, I was both impressed and bemused, thinking, so who am I? Am I Gustav? Am I Walter? Am I Franz? Or someone else in your sublime Begin? And the poem's about that. That was quite a picture put to me, walking north in sunlight years ago. It's graven still upon my memory, in words at once so colourful and bold that even now they win my wonderment. There's something that I have to say to you, and that is this, you suddenly announced, that I am alma mater, and I know a genius when I see one. You are set to do things of which I want to be a part. Or words to that effect, without a stammer, fully formed and confident, as if you'd meditated long upon the thought. As we strolled so freely through that southern spring, our own Ringstrasse and surrounding streets. Alma, I almost burst out with a laugh, are you for real, as in Tom Lehrer's song? Am I then Mahler, Gropius, or Werfel, or someone else in your sublime Begin? Alma! Ha! You took my breath away. We've had, since then, of course, our replica of Alma's life with Mahler in Vienna. 2 girls and many compositions, right? A love that struggled long to find its way, then rose at last above their tragic fate. For you've been less the Alma of Vienna than the muse I'd long for, more than for a wife, my anima, my soul, the gift of life, who, since she would or could not simply stay, has raised me up to dream and fly away. The 10th poem is called A Taste for Books, and one of the great things that Claudia and I quickly found we had in common is a passion for reading and ideas. And needless to say, one of the things that I found most appealing about her is she's very intelligent and articulate, even though English was her second language. So this poem draws again on Virginia Woolf and Orlando, but it's very much about the idea of being well-read, being highly literate, being immersed in a world of books and ideas. You and I succumbed from early childhood to the affliction that the droll Virginia Woolf so mordantly suggests must have infected the colourful Orlando in his cradle, wafted out of Greece and Italy in the floating spoor of asphodel, the bane of knightly vigour and ambition, of pedigree and masterful volition, enfeebling hand and eye and noble tongue, sapping vital instincts in the young. The love of literature is a disease, slyly quoth that wolf in writer's clothing, which of its fatal nature substitutes a phantom for reality, such that the likes of the young baronet Orlando lose any sense of their inheritance, and so neglect their pleasures and their duties, besotted by the squiggle on a page, that the lordship and the fortune they've been gifted dissolve among their books into a mist. Yet it has been quite otherwise with us, who, lacking lordship of Orlando's kind, and granted strong immunities from birth to those conceits that addle noble brains, absorbed into our blood the potent spoor, and turned the fateful germ of asphodel, which so depletes the force of feudal houses, into the stuff of our transcendent dreams, of well-informed and boldly free opinions, a greater wealth than manners or dominions. The 11th poem is Proust's Way, and for those who are unfamiliar with Marcel Proust, perhaps even the name, he was a French author who died at the age of 50 after a long lung disease, and the great achievement of his life, to be strictly accurate, the only achievement of his life really, was that he wrote an immensely long novel, 4,000 pages, called In Search of Lost Time, sometimes translated as Remembrance of Things Past. And Claudia, as this poem remarks, knew of Proust and knew of the novel rather better than I did when she and I first met. And it was only well after she left that I myself, when seriously ill, read In Search of Lost Time and find it thoroughly beautiful and stimulating. So this poem is a reflection on that. You, my love, and no one else, unless perhaps it was Roger Shattuck, a year or so before you first arrived, introduced me to the world of Proust. You used to claim, to my bewilderment, I am Odette de Crécy, with a smile. But strange as it now seems, all the while, I thought you said Odette the Crazy. You, my love, and no one else, not Shattuck, much less de Botton, must have been, therefore, the very first to murmur Proustian nothings in my presence. You, however, did become Odette, hence some poems I wrote you years ago, about lost time and feeling I was Swan, conversing with Marcel beside the Seine. You were long gone when I actually read the whole 6 volumes of the masterwork, while ill and all but corked, like Proust, dwelling on remembrance of things past. You, if no one else, will understand how passages from each volume now inform the Proustian reworkings of my life, the autopoiesis I'm embarked upon. When in Swan's Way Proust wrote of floating flowers, or in the pages of Within a Budding Grove compared bewildered love with lack of causal science, or when in Sodom and Gomorrah he described the Luxor obelisk as pink nougat, the moon a bitten orange, he wrote for me, and you, and no one else. Poem 12 is called My Apricot, and again it's fairly self-explanatory, but it's a favourite of mine for sentimental reasons, and as these poems have gone, of course, they've become more and more intimate poems directly addressing Claudia, as distinct from sharing with her tales from my past, and this one's a very intimate one. We've come quite a distance, haven't we, since you left a note for me, which I've always kept and always will, that commences Dearest Frodo, a nom d'amour that's tacitly explained, of course, within these lyric pages, and which concludes a kiss, your apricot. That, all on its own, is testimony to the freshness of the love you bore me then. It's moved me every which way ever since. But down the lapse of time and from afar, you've indicated that, by invitation, you gave a talk at an Opus Dei villa on the highest and most abstract of all themes, thinking and being, in a cocktail lounge. Ah, that's my wondrous muse. Thoughts were of Heidegger. But then the Bec de Gaz came back to mind. Simone de Beauvoir's colourful account of Sartre, Aron, and herself discussing phenomenology in that Parisian bar. And here an apricot came into the picture. You see, young Raymond Aron said to Sartre, indicating, Beauvoir claimed, in prime of life, an apricot cocktail sitting on the table, if you are a phenomenologist, you can make philosophy of actual things like this. Sartre turned pale with emotion, Beauvoir wrote, for here was just the thing he'd longed to do. And here we are, beloved apricot, with just such work now being done by you. The 13th poem is called Festival of Promise, and again, this is addressing Claudia quite directly, and it's about our shared vision well after we'd actually separated as to what life was really about, what we shared, what we could do together. You are so supremely full of life. It's evident in all you do and say, while I incline to fatalistic gloom, defying odds to die another day. But given that we both love Zarathustra, let's reflect in passing on his claim that each of us should seek the kind of death that's less an accident than choice and aim. This doctrine still sounds strange. The prophet said that one die neither early nor too late, but seek instead to hallow what one's lived for, rather than accept some random fate. A festival of promise to survivors is how he'd have us think of our demise. An artful end, a dignified conclusion, consistent with one's life in others' eyes. The doctrine's quite astringent, let's agree. Zarathustra scornfully allows the passive and superfluous recoil from the kind of death free spirits should espouse. All too many live, and all too long. Would that storms would shake them from the tree. A ripe and timely death is for the strong, the self-possessed, the purposeful, and free. Give all you have in homage to the earth. Bestow on it the honey of your soul. Throw yourself towards your chosen end, and go down with the sun fulfilled and whole. I think that almost all of this rings true, but stumble over what it means for you. The 14th poem is called Shrove Tide, and this and the following poem are about the emotional difficulties, the interpersonal struggle that we had to really build a partnership, particularly from a distance. But I think they're strong poems, and this one, and they're both tributes to what we've accomplished, not angry accusations or despair. Shrove Tide. How did your emotional tenacity ride out the chronic unhappiness of living with my sexless gloom? That's years ago, of course, another life. But tears and anger came back then, for you felt trapped, an unloved wife. We're just like two old people, you declared once, mournfully, who've lost interest in one another, to which I simply gloomed. I knew not how to love, or rather to desire with love and innocence, having been too often burned. While you, starved, you thought alone of mother love, hungered so intensely for unalloyed, demonstrative affection. What tangled psychic knots bound our being then, withholding us from both simplicity and joy? Still, most knots have been loosed or cut by years of existential therapy in which I suffered keenly your remembered pain. Could I rewind the closely ravelled rope, gathering in the past for better binding, I'd gently spare you all those inner chafings. I'd weep for both our knotted pasts, and, letting fall the hair of grief, baptize our psyches in the purest love. But we've been shriven by the passing years. Your vivacity won out, and my pure thought has salved our psyches, dissolving all our fears. Poem 15. Finding the Clearing. I couldn't give you happiness, but only abstract thought, and so our ancient married life quite quickly turned out fraught. Yet you'll agree, in hindsight now, that each of us was caught at unawares by complexes which neither could unravel. Moods and fears and traumas past that bound us up and dimly cast our fates on roads to travel, whose course nor ends could be foreseen in any determinate time or fashion, so that faring them or finding them baffled foresight, imposing indeterminacy. Yet each of us held to subtle things, to which we were inclined to cling, as lodestones of our fumbled intimacy, memories of bright sayings past, moments that shone or ached, perceptions of profounder possibilities, glimpsed through the prisms or lenses that mediated our mutually tortured gaze, out of the thickets of love long lacked. For what each of us somehow still conceived might yet arise along the shadowed roads, might yet break out into a bright clearing, might, after all, enfold our psyche's fates in the very dance of awakened being that we now so improbably enjoy. The next poem, the 16th, is called Extrafloral Nectars, and it returns to the theme of the nature of intimacy, and uses a particular metaphor about flowers and ants to point to what I found most attractive about Claudia and what had me persevere in the relationship and write poetry for her and grow to love her authentically. There was, a century since, a botanist whose work has been neglected and forgotten, who corresponded quite extensively with the master naturalist Charles Darwin on what to make of extrafloral nectars, but their views were diametrically opposed. Now, why would I, my extrafloral love, given our extensive correspondence, raise this subject here in poetry, dig up Federico del Pino as if he held a lure for you or me, as if his memory promised pollination? Well, del Pino, don't you know, advanced a theory neatly published in a monograph, about the lure of myrmecephalous plants. 3,000 species being listed, which use their honeyed extrafloral nectars to entice, addict, and subjugate the ants. Ants, of course, are drawn to floral nectars, since nothing attracts insects more than sugar. But many other subtle chemicals within these nectars, such as alkaloids, manipulate the guileless myrmeces and render them the servants of the plants. Your extrafloral nectar, sweetest love, like the decoctions of acacia plants, those master myrmecephalous ant seducers, drew me to you, but your alkaloids, your subtler charms, are what addict me to generating verse as your Delpino. The 17th poem is called The Secret Key, and this is actually a reflection on the impact that Claudia had on me when I was seriously ill with melanoma, and particularly metastatic melanoma, that she was so loving, so concerned, so in touch, even though living on the other side of the world. And I believe it made a difference to my surviving the disease and recovering. Life takes its toll, and wounds appear where most we're worn, and if the toll's severe, rents are torn, or tumours born, or wrought within the fabric of our being. So it's been with me for many years, and so, as you well know, the good physicians have excised from my plagued body many times the feral cells that bid to overwhelm me, or have fed me wondrous chemistries instead. All this, no doubt, has saved me from demise, allowing me to write my recent books, permitting me to travel far and wide, at intervals between or grappling with lamenesses and months of sheer exhaustion. But pneuma may have been the secret key that's opened up the door to longer life, and had my surgeons wonder at the ways I've long defied their worst prognostications, despite the odds in population data. Quite why this has been so, it isn't clear, which leads to Hippocratic conversations, such as those with my good doctor in Brazil, of how he'd love to bottle to clone my immune defiance of the said disease. Yet could they reproduce the biochemistry that held the line in limb and lymph and groin? I doubt they'd find the subtleties they sought, for they perhaps derive from pneuma's arts those wondrous workings you have catalyzed. We're now in part 3 of the book, and we begin with a poem called Lord Byron's Travels. Claudia and I had begun to travel quite widely ourselves by then, and I took the opportunity to read Lord Byron's very famous and very long poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is about his travels in Europe. We travelled far more widely than Lord Byron, but he wrote well, and so it gave me the opportunity for a poem. Lord Byron's travels took him far afield, though not as far as I have been with you. But more important, we still have the yield of what Childe Harold saw and gave its due, from Lisbon east, in Cantos 1 and 2. His countless observations sparkle still, attributed to fictive Harold's eyes. His learning and imagination fill the mutest landscapes with such rich surmise that hidden meanings constantly arise. Thus, stanza 39 in Canto 2 hails Lover's Leap, where Sappho took her leave, on Cape Leucadia, as Byron knew, and he, a poet, still saw fit to grieve in gliding past the lesbian's ancient grave. The later, longer cantos, 3 and 4, take Byron down the full length of the Rhine, past relics of the tyrannies of yore, through Switzerland, then to the Palatine, with Venetian interludes, and Florentine. At one point, as he skirted Rhenish towers, the traveller paused to praise the deep blue eyes of peasant girls who brought him lily flowers. He called their simple world a paradise, in all except the absence of his lass. Quite late, in Canto 4, he came to Rome, as we shall know, 2 centuries since his time. He hailed the mighty ruin as Europe's home, lamented its prolonged decay in rhyme, and so completed the romantic climb. The next poem, the 19th, is Margaret Island, Budapest. This was written at a time when Claudia was still living with me in Australia, but I was abroad on my way to run a seminar for the CIA in Washington. And she wasn't with me. But I passed through Rome and Budapest on that journey, briefly in each case. And I wrote this poem about the heart of Budapest and the beautiful island, refuge island, a haven for writers and so on, in the middle of the Danube, in between Buda and Pest. It goes as follows. You should have been with me in Budapest. My journal makes it clear I'd wished you were. To walk with me across the Czerny Bridge, to gaze from Castle Hill across the Danube, stroll along Andrassy Avenue and enter, in some awe, St. Stephen's Square. But I was passing through en route to Washington to run some workshops for the CIA, and so as I explored the ancient city, well, not so ancient, just 1,000 years, and breathed among its monuments and beauties, I vowed I'd bring you back with me one day. The Danubian Grand Hotel on Margaret Island, the geographic heart, they say, of Europe, I noted as the perfect place to stay, with Claudia as a writer and a poet. In the charming old Franciscan convent there, long since a house for writers and their muses. Did you know that all the isle is filled with roses, 200 kinds in odoriferous gardens, beautifully kept among plane groves, and that the convent's founding abbess, Margaret, is celebrated annually on her birthday with Holy Mass held in the open air? Conscious of the picture Lukács painted of the city as it was when in its prime, and Frigesi's book on Bartók's Budapest, I sat beside the Danube lost in time, as poets and historians will do, absorbing what I longed to share with you. The 20th poem is titled Pantheon. Claudia and I finally did get to visit Rome, and I wrote a handful of poems for her about the experience, which was very special. And the Pantheon, as many of you presumably will know, is a very old, very well-preserved building in the heart of Rome, which is a temple to all the planetary gods. The original design and expense were by Marcus Agrippa, the great general and military backer of Augustus. And then some 2 centuries later, the Emperor Hadrian had it refurbished, but still left it ascribed to Marcus Agrippa, which was generous of Hadrian, who had quite an ego himself. And I guess he must have felt that he had built many other things, and so he didn't need to take away Agrippa's name from the Pantheon. So this is a reflection on my visiting it with Claudia. We reached the fabled Pantheon at dusk, meandering down from the Borghese Gardens, where we'd lingered on the Pincio, discoursing on the Villa of Lucullus as the sun declined above the Vatican. We made our way past Trinita dei Monti, and through the crowds upon the Spanish steps, with passing thoughts of dying Keats and Shelley. We cast our coins into the Trevi fountain, then came, at last, to the Sanctissimum. Remembered Nietzsche's madman sagely asking, when hauled out from a church for having chanted his requiem for the eternal God, what are these buildings now, if not the tombs and sepulchres of what we thought divine? In just that spirit, surely, Hadrian, the empire's ruler at its apogee, reconceived what M. Agrippa built, bequeathing us a truly stunning shrine to all the 7 planetary gods. But as with other monuments that day, what most impressed itself upon my mind was less the awesome structure in itself than your naively beautiful response to all the layered meanings of that space. And how, in Catholic pews beneath the dome, that Michelangelo himself described as the work of nothing less than angels, we sat by candlelight and spoke in earnest of all our deepest thoughts and future plans. The 21st poem is titled Being in Rome, and of the poems I wrote for about spending time with her in Rome, this is probably what you might call the most existential, and although it spells this out internally, it's worth remarking before reciting it that one of the high priority places I took her to was the baths of Carcalla, which I'd been to quite a number of times, and she'd never been there, and I was confident that she would find it awe-inspiring, and she really did. And I took a photo of her, which is what actually inspired the poem later. Just gazing up at these soaring arches and these ruinous, immense walls of brick, which have stood for 1,800 years, in a bathing complex which could accommodate in its prime 1,500 bathers simultaneously, which, when you think of any contemporary bathing establishment, is simply mind-boggling. And the baths not only had these hot, tepid and frigid baths, but they had running tracks and glades where people could sit and talk under trees. They had meeting rooms. They had massage parlours. They were a place where you could spend entire days. And this, the ruins of this is what we visited. It was a wonderful thing to be able to share with her. Being in Rome. If they document our lives at any point, that day in Rome will surely have to feature, although in fact they don't do such things, neglectful both of being and of time. Will even we agree on what took place between Testaccio and the Arch of Constantine? Here's my take, beloved, for the record. After croissants at the Café Barberini, we set off past the ruined gate of Paul. I gestured at the mass of Aurelian's wall and spoke of where the Gothic camps had been, but led you on across the Aventine. How much did I relate of that hill's tale, conscious of our evanescent passing? I mentioned Roman mansions, I recall, and their looting on the city's fall, my mind aflame with histories that I knew. But what do all such histories mean to you? Beyond that one of 7 fabled hills, we came, as we had purposed, to the baths. And there, as I had hoped, your awe awoke. For there the soaring arches that remain, the hints and hollowed haunts of ancient marbles, sighed Rome to you with all that implies. I've written of the baths of Caracalla, and been immersed in their imagined glories. I've dreamed for years of concerts in their gardens, of Shelley's sojourn there, and other stories. But your gratitude and shining chestnut hair have quite transformed my sense of being there. The 22nd poem is titled In Jerusalem Last Week, and in fact, although it sits more than halfway through the book, it was the first 30-liner, the first poem in this set that I wrote. And it was written after I had been in Jerusalem. I was on my way via Malta and Munich and Lisbon to Caracas to visit Venezuela in 2016 for the first time. It really just captures an experience I had walking around in Jerusalem. And it clearly addresses Claudia, who I was on my way to visit in Venezuela. It goes as follows. In Jerusalem last week, meandering in the German colony, I crossed Masaryk Street, named for a defenestrated Czech of liberal democratic disposition, murdered by communist thugs 3 years after liberation, if one can call it that, from the Holocaust and Nazi rule. Does that defenestration ring a bell in Caracas at this time? Would you say that quiet naming of a street in, of all places, the German colony, in, of all places in our time, Jerusalem of the knives and scissors, rings a bell for all Democrats? I felt so, passing by in peace, and then I chanced upon a simple flowered balcony above the Hebrew road that slivers river-like through the German colony, and felt at once a curled-up intimacy and partnership with you. There was a nook for 2 minds, breathing liberty and high aims, a retreat for warmth and love. In Jerusalem last week. But we are now in Caracas. The next poem, No Water on Avila, Hugo, which is the 23rd poem, was written not in Caracas when I was there with Claudia, but a few days later when I'd flown on to Brazil. But it's about an experience we shared in Caracas, where there is Mount Avila is a public park in the heart of the city, which had been nationalized by Chavez And in consequence, like all too many things that get nationalised, it had run down. And due to the mismanagement of the economy, one of the things that had given way was the water supply in the public park. There was no bottled water. It had proven difficult to import given the way the economy gummed up. And so, in a public park, you couldn't get water. And so I took that up as a diatribe or an indictment of Hugo Chavez and his pretenses to be a liberator and a good manager of a country that had everything it needed to be prosperous and had been relatively democratic. Chavez vive, cry your posters in the streets, and from the sides of buildings daubed by artful Cuban propagandists where your vulgar signature is scrawled, your narrow eyes peer unblinkingly down upon the criminal scene of rank impunity and shameless agitprop, lengthening queues and smart bacacheros bartering in nearly worthless bolivares for the country you've made insolvent. There is no water on Avila, Hugo. Sign off on that high up on the sides of futures looming beyond your ken. Boast of this Bolivarian achievement, you paragon of demotic braggadocio. Neither bottled nor running water in a nationalized park overlooking the very mausoleum of your stolen hero, overlooking Chacao, where your crony, Aristobalo, took his gated mansion. No water on Avila, you stupid bungler. Brownouts and breakdowns on all sides, shortages of medicine, soap and oil, and now a Looney Tune bus driver calls out Chavez vive as he runs Venezuela over a social precipice. This, you blockhead, is revolution? This is the price of Bolivarian socialism, but your lot are clueless about prices of water, oil, foodstuffs, justice, anything. The next poem, the 24th, is called The Pact We've Formed. I spent a week with Claudia in Venezuela, then I flew to Brazil. I was on my way to the International Cancer Conference with my surgeon. And I began in Rio. And I'd never been to Brazil before. And I went from Rio with the surgeon, David Speakman, to Brasilia, to Iguazu Falls and to São Paulo. And this poem was inspired by two things, the magnificence of Rio de Janeiro and the conversations I'd had with Claudia in Caracas and Valencia about our relationship after, by then, 12 years. 6 years ago, in Kirchner's Buenos Aires, you turned to me and said in a quiet tone, "Look carefully at all you see around, since this, as cities go in all the cone, is the finest and the grandest that you'll see. It's all downhill in quality from here." But how, in saying such a scathing thing, could you have failed to take into account great Rio, with its beach and circling hills? For once breathed the air of Ipanema, and heard Brazilian music in the streets, I have to say one takes a different view. I drove in from Huvim by private cab, and revelled in a pulsing sense of place. Confessing to imprisonment in English, I told my man, in halting Spanish phrases, that all the world finds Rio fascinating, as much in truth as any city known. He answered me in swooshing Portuguese, with warmth that showed he'd plainly understood the root and sense of all I'd tried to say. He pointed then to Corcovado Hill, upon which stands the giant sculptured form of Cristo the Redeemer, as he's called. But it was not the sculptured looming Christ that made me feel redeemed on Rio's strand. It was, instead, Atlantic Avenue, the beauteous sweep of Copacabana Beach, its contrast with the grimness of Caracas, and the pact we've formed for bravely thinking big. The next poem, 25, is called São Paulo on Foot. So I went to São Paulo for the cancer conference with David, and we took a city tour, and we had many conversations and strolled looking at street art and so forth. It was a memorable time, and at one point on my own I took a long walk, and this is quite a modernist poem, this one, but I trust nevertheless fully coherent. It's just my reflections as I walked. São Paulo on Foot. Avenida Paulista was once a country road, cut along a high ridge looking toward the hill where Saint Anchieta and his Jesuits, centuries before, built Sao Paulo to evangelize the ill-fated Guaranis. Who would guess from present evidence that it had then become the boulevard of the coffee barons, when Hardim, east of their height, was still a botanical garden? Who would guess now, among the serried towers of glass and steel, that they are so new in provenance, that this overwhelming conurbation is the construction of 2 lifetimes? Yet down Avenida Paulista yesterday I took my way past all the towers, wide-eyed and photographically conscious, like a Guarani with a camera, blessing myself in the names of all my most tutelary deities, casting my vision like a net over all that was redolent, coloured, vibrant as sea creatures, or scarred with social meaning, with signatures of opulence or inequity, from Consolação to the Casa das Rosas, capturing in that net the myriad tokens of shimmering, arcane thought worlds displayed on newsstands in Portuguese, with you dancing in all my senses. The 26th poem is called Time in Naipe's Hair. I think I mentioned a few minutes ago that David Speakman and I visited, among other places, Iguazu Falls, which is a spectacular and beautifully maintained nature reserve. And the falls themselves are every bit as spectacular as Niagara Falls. And reading a little of their history and the mythology surrounding them, I wrote the following poem, which clearly again addresses Claudia. There can be no finer metaphor of the flow of time tumbling over the cataracts of all that is the case, let's say, than the majestic falls of Iguazu, where 3 far borders meet. Above the falls I briefly stayed, ensconced in a bubble of luxury, the Belmont Hotel das Cataratas, giving me the freedom to contemplate the rich purity of the metaphor, breathing the air of time's flow. The stones there remember Pangaea, she who was the supercontinent for eons until the great dying, when Eurasia and Gondwana split, furrowing the lands in new ways, sundering life's archaic past. Such time has lapsed in these waters, a lush confluence of Eden and geology, where the old world's mythology, swallowed by the devil's throat, mingles with the Kayapangwi legend of Taroba's love for Naipe long ago. The river god, Mboyi, was owed annual sacrifice of a lovely girl. Taroba defied that and was shaped into a tree watered by Naipe's hair, a tale that might have flowed from Ovid, but is now ours, my love, to share. The 27th poem has us in Geneva, Claudia and I, that is, and the poem is called At the Restaurant Casanova. We were seated in the Restaurant Casanova with a panoramic view across the lake, and so, at intervals, as we conversed, could gaze upon Mont Blanc's iconic heights, with all their fabled pasts of poetries, with all their connotations of prestige, from Wordsworth's Meditations to the climbs by Malaby, rehearsing Everest. But we were there to scale our own Mont Blanc, and both envisaged Himalayan exploits. That's what's always made our love enticing, your bold insistence that we both think big, not regarding merely basic things like money or a villa in Provence, but heights requiring real imagination, like political reform in Venezuela, or the composition of a classic book. It was because we spoke of things like these, and the implications of the Panama Papers, that Mont Blanc itself remained a mise-en-scene. But afterwards, returning to our lodgings, you quite astonished me when, in our cab, you sang If You're Going to San Francisco, having asked quite whimsically that it be played, and sang it with your wonted innocence, so that all the conversation we had had was wafted off to when young Scott Mackenzie had imagined back in 1967 that promiscuous sex and wreaths of flowers would bring about the fall of earthly powers. Poem 28 is called Agreement over Pina Coladas, and it captures a little occasion where Claudia and I were in Panama together, and we found this rooftop bar where they sold the cheapest, the largest, and the most delicious pina coladas either of us had ever tasted. And we were looking across the water to the business centre of the city and reflecting on two things: the nature of our relationship, and how, in a sense, we were like the two Americas that were linked by the Panama Canal, the two oceans that were linked by the Panama Canal. And we used these as metaphors for saying, we were reaching to each other across the world. And it was a very special relationship, we agreed. It goes as follows. No one else, I bet, has sat in Panama, as we just did, my beauty, well seated at Tantalo's rooftop bar, sipping the most generous of pina coladas, conscious of the history of the isthmus, freshly reminded of its geological, or more precisely its tectonic past, conscious of its twofold global function, linking continents, linking oceans, and feeling all this in our fingertips, conscious of our being there as Dasein, drinking in all this as our experience, in animated talk and loving glances, bringing all our past into those hours, projecting it into our pondered futures. Didn't we concur at Tantalos? Didn't we design a fresh agreement, looking from the old colonial world across to all the towers of the modern? Didn't we acclaim the tectonic movement which, drifting over mantle, underwater, over the wide earth, brought us here? Didn't we acclaim the very isthmus as our own bridge, our vibrant metaphor, knowing the place of bridges in our lives, knowing the poetics of our crossings, ever since we bridged the Rio Tahoe, fording it from opposite directions? We dreamed, but there we drank, tantalized by all that lies beyond. Poem 29, second last, is called Archaic Earth, and it's related in a way to Agreement of Pina Coladas, because it takes a geological metaphor and uses it to sketch, let's call it a heroic vision, a dream vision of how Claudia made me feel and the nature of our relationship and how I wanted to be inside that relationship. In the prehistory of our present intimacy, casting about for how to leap the void, open at my feet by your flight, I conceived our love as all of life on earth, and fancied I was some Silurian Nureyev. Of course, I couldn't dance. I was a cripple in almost every sense, and not least sexually. Dance, with my flat feet and shattered heart. Nureyev, my antinomy, my shadow. But Silurian, that's the secret clue. You'd come to me from another continent, challenged me to see my own anew, then changed your mind, so up and off you flew. But our continental shelves, our inner worlds, had collided like two vast tectonic plates. That is where Silurian leaps to mind, out of deep time and all that is the case. And Nureyev, my counter-self, my avatar, my lithe persona fleeing from the Bolshoi, danced across the Pan-Thalassic Ocean. He danced me back 400 million years, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring upon Gondwana, when life was just emerging first on land, and our two present continents were fused, and you were life, and I was not confused. There you pointed to the mystic scene and took my hippocampus to its shores, where sea gods called out, "Dance for all the world! Dance, emergent one, for all your worth, on nascent limbs, on the archaic earth." I'm going to conclude with a 30th poem called Percy Bysshe Shelley. I identify quite strongly with Shelley for a couple of reasons. He was a passionate poet, a romantic poet. He was a poet who wrote in English. He died young, which is something I can't achieve. But he wanted to see political reform. He kept the company of Byron. He lived a colourful life. He wrote fiercely in defence of poetry and imagination. He wrote Prometheus Unbound and almost set the theme, the dream of industrial civilization, that it could really set humanity free. So this poem is a tribute to Shelley, and it's, I think, a fitting end to this particular recitation, because it's me, in a sense, celebrating being a poet and addressing that celebration to Claudia. Shelley died when he was half my age, and left behind a monument of verse. He perished reckless as he'd lived, heedless of reed or storm warning, but passionate he was in prosody. Sprung of the Sussex squirearchy, he learned his Latin and was gifted Greek from childhood at fabled Field Place. Fabled, I write, since it was Tudor, save for its belated Georgian wing. It harboured many mysteries and attics, as well as arboured gardens full of life, where boisterous Bish adventured, returning thence with wild imaginings, confabulated for the ever-eager ears of his young adoring sisters, as, in like manner, he affected alchemy, plunged his febrile brain among the strange books, and annotated them with horned sprites. He was fey, and broke with his staid father, not least on account of a brutal schooling that instilled in him a turbulent character, at once a leveller and violent in disdain of all that might advise, accost, or thwart him. His liberty he loved, and roamed abroad. Described in his most memorable verses are the fall of Ozymandias, king of kings, and Prometheus unbound, defiant hero. He revelled in Caracalla's ruined bars, then, tempting fate at 30, died at sea. Well, so that's 30 of 100 poems. I've enjoyed reciting them. I look forward to Claudia's response to them, but I hope that you, listener, whoever you are, have found them stirring. Each will probably appreciate different poems, but it's wonderful to be able to write poetry, to be able to share poetry. And the manifesto I wrote for myself half a century ago was that I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be able to inject poetry into my life, to live a poetic life. And Claudia, of course, urged me to fully embrace that. That's the origin of this book and of this recital.